this is a great text, The Logic of Congressional Action by Douglas Arnold. It's a classic text in public policy. Did folks have a chance to read those 6 chapters? There's a lot of material. I told you when we first started that it would take a long time to get through. It's academic material. It's fairly accessible, but still, I understand, not like the Craft and Furlong text. For those of you who did, this brief discussion will, I think, help put some flesh on the bones and give you some more context. For those who haven't, it'll at least introduce you to the highlights of Arnold's classic work. And the first thing we need to understand about this the overarching theme, he starts off by stating something that is not novel, but it's an underlying assumption of his text, which is in some ways disputed, but not widely. Based on research by David Mayhew, he references him a few times in the introduction. David Mayhew wrote a big book years before this text. And it essentially posits that members of Congress do what primarily? What do they want most? To get reelected, right? This is what their driving motivation is. Rational choice. So members care intensely about reelection. That's where we start. There's a separate book that lays out the evidence and justifications for that, the David Mayhew text. We're not going to be debating that or discussing that tonight. This is the starting point for Arnold. He says, okay, members want to get reelected. Great. Still, what do they have to think about when they're making decisions and when they're casting votes? Sure, broadly speaking, we could say they want to get reelected. That itself invites even more questions. How do they think about the prospect of getting reelected? And this is where I'll point out 3 kind of key things you should pull from this text. One is that members are smart, mostly. I know we don't sometimes think of them that way, but maybe the pejorative word would be cunning, thoughtful, crafty. And they're not just thinking, well, I need to get reelected. They actually think more carefully than that, according to Arnold. And the first thing that they think about, of course, reelection has to do with the public, garnering votes to support what you've done. But Arnold suggests that we have 2 types of publics, if you will. Attentive and inattentive. Why does that matter? Does anyone remember or could tell us what the difference is between these 2 publics?
It matters because the attentive group is usually smaller than the inattentive a lot of times, and the question is whether or not the inattentive public is going to, after the decision is made, if they're going to hold that against the politician, or if they aren't going to care about it at all, and whether or not they should vote based on this smaller population that probably will hold it against them, or on this bigger population that may or may not vote against them.
That's right. There are 2 groups, essentially. Inattentive and attentive. The attentive group is typically smaller, not always, but typically thought of as smaller. And attentive, in a sense, is informed citizens. People who care, who are following you as a member of Congress, tracking your votes, paying attention to what you do. naturally, Arnold suggests these are people we care about if we're congressmen, because they're going to hold us accountable. They're going to see if we're doing what we say we're doing. They're going to understand if we're voting the way that they like us to vote. And so the congressmen are focused a lot on that. And that's not earth-shattering, right? That's not surprising. That makes sense to us. But what Arnold suggests, which is really interesting, is that, you know what, there's an even bigger group that they're more worried about in many ways. That's the inattentive public. Why would we care about the inattentive public? Do we care that they're inattentive? Are we happy with that?
Well, we care about what would make them inattentive.
Exactly. It's not the fact that they're inattentive that's so interesting. It's, can I predict or anticipate what would make them suddenly become aware and have some awakening? What moment? What could cause them to switch from being one to the other? So he suggests that, you know, just because you're in one class doesn't mean you're always going to remain in that class. So congressmen need to focus a lot on understanding what their votes will do, potentially, to cause a group of inattentive public to become attentive. Sometimes what can cause inattentive to become attentive isn't within the congressman's purview. It's not a vote, it's some other event, right? In a sense, all this relates to other things we've talked about. Focusing events can cause people to become more aware or concerned, right? But, you know, congressmen are, you know, no one can necessarily predict the unpredictable. So what you do is you think in the context of how are my votes going to affect this transition? Are any people going to be really upset and mobilized and shift to become attentive and then hold me accountable? So in a way, it's understanding the preferences. That's the second point. Preferences and potential preferences. Of these two publics. How might a congressman understand the preferences of an attentive public? How do people express their preference if they're attentive to an issue?
Party affiliation.
That's one way, party affiliation. But also through the feedback mechanism, like writing your congressman. This is how you can express your preferences to your member freely. Party affiliation or even organization or group membership will signal your preferences. If you're a member of an interest group, like the NRA, a grassroots organization, the ACLU, any number of them you can imagine, people who are invested in those ideas are going to care more. They're basically revealing their preferences through their membership, right? They're not so hard to deal with because you know where they stand, where they're coming from. What's tough is the potential preferences. And that's really difficult when you're talking about an inattentive public and the preferences they might have if certain things happen. So with respect to how a congressman makes a decision, weighing these factors, several things are important. So this is kind of a subgroup belief that beneath the preferences and potential preferences. What causes someone to develop preferences? With respect to policy change, it often has to do with the magnitude of change, how that policy will affect them, how much, what's the distribution of costs and benefits. Arnold discusses this here. And here he stumbles across a really important concept we'll talk about. Concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. Can someone explain that to me as succinctly as possible? What's the general idea behind this?
Like a small group is going to benefit from the cost of the general public.
That's very succinct. When a policymaker is making decisions, their ideal scenario is to provide a concentrated benefit. That means a small group reaps a big benefit from the policy. And to disperse those costs widely. This has to do with the magnitude of change. You don't want the costs to be so great that they awaken an inattentive public and cause them to have a preference against what you've done and then exact vengeance on you in an election. An illustration of this might be, well, there are a number of them. Does anyone have an offhand?
On the dairy subsidy, where everybody's paying like a couple more cents for every milk gallon, but
Agriculture policy in general. The dairy policy is what he discusses in the text. And the interesting thing about that is how it shifts. How does policy change in the world of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs? But agriculture policy is a classic example of concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. A great example, aside from the dairy industry, one that I think is even better, is sugar subsidies. So you guys probably don't pay attention to this or know this. Does anybody grow sugar? Sugar cane in your backyard? I don't know if you would grow it in this weather. This summer, maybe. Does anybody here like grow beets? By the way, you know sugar comes from a lot of different places, not just sugar cane, but beets, beet farms. You can pull it from the beet juice somehow. I don't know how it's made. We all have sugar. We eat it. It's in all our, well, not in everything, but it's in a lot of things. So the thing about sugar is we all, let's say, consume it on one level or another. Either directly when you buy a pack of Domino's at the shopping center, or indirectly when it's sort of in your food as a part of the process of production. So cereal, or bread, or other things that, does bread have sugar in it? I don't even know. Cinnamon bread. Sugar's used in a lot of things, right? So, where is it made? Actually, in a pretty limited number of places in America. Florida, Louisiana, the southern Gulf Coast, sugar cane. And then actually in the Midwest, a lot of beet farms out there. So two geographically different areas and represented by Republicans and Democrats, sort of mixed party allegiances. But they're unified on this issue because there's this notion that the world price of sugar from a place like, say, Cuba, where we can't import sugar from, or the Caribbean, where the cost of labor and production are a lot lower than they are here. The world price of sugar is low, and if America imported that, however it would benefit consumers, it would probably be a very big threat to these sugar manufacturers, sugar companies. And there's policy about basically prohibiting or deterring or discouraging the importation of lower cost sugar. And essentially what it means is there's a concentrated benefit to those sugar manufacturers, which is very important to them, by the way. Without these subsidies and protectionist policies, they might go out of business. And that's your livelihood at stake, right? Now, you and me, we live in Virginia, we don't grow sugar, we probably don't have family members who work at a sugar plant. But we buy sugar. And as a result of those policies that give benefits to a small, narrow group, sugar growers. The costs are dispersed among Virginia and California, the whole Northeast, the rest of the country, right? Even people in Florida who don't work in the sugar business, are getting higher costs because of that. But it's not something we notice. When you buy a box of cereal, is there a line in your receipt that suggests the cost of your cereal is a nickel or 20 cents greater, 30 cents? It's hardly even measured how much more expensive that stuff costs. And even if we did measure it, it's a small amount, right? We would say, well, geez, it's a dime. My gum costs another, 2 pennies, a stick of gum that I eat. Yeah. That's hard to get really upset about or motivated, right? So basically, when we have members from other geographic regions who aren't from Florida, who aren't from the Midwest, who don't have any sugar interests in their public at all, what are they more predisposed to do? Well, as we talked about last week in the decision-making process, there's a lot of opportunities to use that vote to earn favor with other members from that region. Log rolling, vote trading. But the notion is these policies are very easy to justify when in fact maybe logically we say, well, geez, all that the country's paying higher price for sugarcane, for the foods that have sugar in them, all because of these policies. Well, that's true, but the costs are dispersed over such a large number of us that it's small. And it's not the type of cost that would get us motivated. The magnitude of that policy is pretty limited. It's hard to get heartburn over a couple dollars a year. Another great example is steel tariffs, right? Steel industry has been suffering in our country for a long time. West Virginia, Northern Panhandle, Pittsburgh, Ohio, industrial history there, a lot of steel makers. Steelers, Pittsburgh, right? People sometimes think it's the Steelers, like Pittsburgh, or like the Thieves. No, it's the Steelers. Steel. They make steel. They used to. They just still do a little, not so much. But the point is, it's something interesting to note. It's not necessarily a partisan dynamic at play. So when President Bush was elected in 2000, came to office in January 2001, one of the first things he did to sort of curry favor, or you want to say pay off, or pay gratitude towards the steel unions in that area and the companies, was to put tariffs on Chinese imports, steel that could cost less for people who use steel to make products, so refrigerators, cars, other things. Those inputs might cost less if they were coming to us from a foreign country, but that would have a devastating effect on a very centralized, narrow part of the economy or region of the country. By enacting steel tariffs, you're giving a concentrated benefit, an extremely concentrated benefit, to a small number of people and dispersing the costs across the population. So this happens, and it's common, and Arnold discusses it. And again, the important thing to understand is it has to do with the magnitude. Right now, there's a point at which those costs could be high enough that you would suddenly care. It also has to do with the relative cost. So let's say the steel tariffs actually do have a somewhat costly effect. I guess it's tough to tease this out of data. Economists have, they'll be all over the map. But you could say, imagine an economist who credibly writes a model that says, hey, the cost of a refrigerator that you want to buy is 10 or 15% more than what it would be. Well, that should get you upset. Maybe it would. Relative to your entire income, it's probably not a lot. But there's a point at which those price increases are noticeable and can make a public care. And so the question is, when you're casting a vote on those issues, do we know the potential preferences that the voters might have if they became aware of the costs? The magnitude is really, really big. the timing of the policy is important to understanding your voters' preferences and potential preferences, because voters, as Arnold describes them, are typically not as fully informed and not able to understand what's called later effects. He distinguishes between early effects and later effects of policy. Early order effects. As the name suggests, it's all about the impact that that policy has on the public. Is it something that is immediately understood? Does it happen instantly? Or are those effects, however dramatic, so far removed from the policy, though caused by it, that the public won't even care? They won't be able to connect the dots. So here's a great way to think about this with respect to education reform. Passing a budget, raising taxes, property taxes to fund schools. The tax increase is a relatively early order effect. People get the connection between this new school budget, the raised taxes, increased teachers' salaries. Those things are all pretty visible and immediate and seen. But there might be later effects that are 6, 7 steps down the road and maybe take time to develop. What maybe is not seen as immediately is the economic benefits to a more educated community that could result not just from the students being more capable once they graduate, but also from companies that are looking to locate in a place that will have an educated workforce. That's several steps down the line, right? And the public, even an attentive public, doesn't always connect those dots. The proximity of the citizens. Proximity. That are being affected to one another. So this is an interesting element where he talks about, it's not number 3, sorry. It's under preferences. Sometimes potential preferences can emerge when people are more densely connected. What's interesting is this book is written before the internet, before social media and all that stuff. This maybe is less of an issue now. Our proximity is only limited by our access to the World Wide Web, right? In many ways, people are becoming more connected and affected by the opinions of others, regardless of their geographic proximity to one another. But the way he discusses it is small communities and groups. Potential preferences can emerge from kind of late to the next factor, an instigator. I think I messed that up again. Hang on. What am I doing? All right, it's not number 3. An instigator. Ralph Nader, I think, is mentioned in the text. Someone who can focus people's preferences and inform them and affect them. Someone who's going to spend a lot of time and energy doing that. And the big, so again, I'm sorry for the confusion over these numbers. There are basically 3 big key things to get out of Arnold. This understanding of that Congress is looking at inattentive and attentive publics, sort of trying to understand primarily what's going to cause an inattentive public to suddenly care, and how is that going to affect me in my re-election. Trying to understand the preferences of these publics, but not just what they express to you through their party affiliation, group affiliation, letters in the mail, but actually what their potential preferences could be, how those preferences could either change or emerge based on these factors, the magnitude of the policies you're contemplating, the timing of the effects those policies cause, the proximity of the population or citizens to one another, and the presence of an instigator, that can all affect preferences and the emergence of preferences. And then finally, the big third point is in line with this instigator. A broader way of thinking about that is a really important role in congressional decision making, the position of a coalition leader. The importance of that. Does a coalition leader have to be a member of Congress? No, you guys are good, shaking your heads, not at all. It can be in the government or out of the government. I think Arnold's coalition leader is akin to our policy entrepreneur. Remember, policy entrepreneur can also be non-government or government. These are people that are trying to affect change and that can put pressure on members to make decisions. And they talk about, Arnold talks about the strategies coalition leaders adopt. In light of this information, coalition leaders can do three things. They can try to persuade, support this legislation because it's a good idea. Or what might be more persuasive to a member than that's just a good idea? That's certainly what we think is the ideal, right? A member's going to support a legislation because it's good. It yields the best outcomes. We went through this great policy analysis process to understand that this is the best policy. So do it. Is that going to work all the time? Probably not. So what else can you do to persuade them?
We won't vote for you.
What's that?
We won't vote for you.
We won't vote for you, or we will vote for you, right? It's actually a good political move. This particular policy you're going to support or fight against is politically helpful to you. Persuade them that it's in their best interest. It's not just in the best interest of the public, but it's in the best interest of you as a politician. That doesn't often work, Arnold says. It's not often enough. So coalition leaders can adopt another strategy. That is this is really probably the critical element of all of this. That is, even if there's a policy is good, or possibly of maybe political benefit to a member if they can see that, they still might not be convinced to support it or engage. Unless you can get them to do so in such a way that masks their accountability for the outcome. This doesn't bode well, right, for congressmen. It doesn't reflect positively on individuals. We're not supposed to be judging them, however. We're supposed to be understanding how they function.
What does the word say?
Traceable, this is procedural. So persuasive arguments, but you can also do procedural. You can make adopt procedural strategies to break what, key phrase here, Arnold calls a traceable link. This is really critical. Understand this. There are procedural mechanisms that will enable members to separate or distance themselves from the results of the decision they've made. And they love that. They're incentivized to pursue those type of things. This can occur in a number of ways. In the budget process, there's something called an omnibus bill. An omnibus bill contains all sorts of spending provisions on a variety of things. It's very complicated and people don't always pay attention to it. The public that is. So if you can put quote unquote controversial elements into an omnibus bill, because it's buried with so many other things that could be viewed as more important, members can get away with voting for that because it's an all or nothing package. Well, I know there's some elements that I don't like, but what we really like is in there, therefore it justifies my vote. So you can't hold me accountable. There's no real traceable connection between my vote for the omnibus bill and the little small provision you don't like. Don't blame me for that, because there was lots of good stuff in it. The other thing, procedural, that's very fascinating, and it's growing, an emerging trend, and it's related to what Mr. Rosselló mentioned earlier, this idea of the super committee. What a brilliant idea. We're going to develop a group of congressmen, bipartisan from both chambers, and they're going to come up with an agreement. Or if we don't like it, we'll vote it down, and then we'll have these automatic cuts. That really doesn't give much decision-making authority to the members at all. It removes them. The ones that are involved and they're vested are, I think, the ones on that super committee. But those people are probably, if we look at them, what's unique about those folks? None of them are extremely politically vulnerable. I think a couple of them are like retiring. Others are party leaders, or at least high-ranking party officials. So the members of that committee don't have to worry so much about being traced to the compromise, if they can even develop one. But the vote is removed, so members can go home to their districts and say, well, I just didn't like what that super committee came up with. That wasn't my decision. They came up with it. It's not my fault. I think the great example that is illustrated in the text is the BRAC Commission. What's a classic version of concentrated benefits dispersed costs? Classic. Military bases, right? Post-Cold War, we have a bigger military budget than we want. I think there's this understanding that we should probably cut defense spending post-Cold War. There's some desire to do that to achieve budgetary benefits. But boy, if you close a military base in someone's state or district, that's going to have pretty catastrophic effects on that member, regardless if they're Republican or Democrat. How can we possibly ever get a consensus? Because everyone's always going to say, yeah, we should cut defense spending, but don't cut my district. Don't close my base. We're not the ones that are wasteful. We're not the ones that are the problem, right? So to overcome this, Congress develops the BRAC Commission, Base Realignment and Closure. Arnold talks about this as a really brilliant strategy to, again, remove any traceable link from the vote to cut military spending and possibly close a base that's in your state and your decision, because it was for the greater good. The goal of the BRAC is, of course, to get a distinguished panel of experts, not politicians, people who we can really trust, to develop the list of bases that are going to close, the base closure list. These are the ones, based on our analysis, impartial, apolitical, not influenced by anything other than what makes the most sense based on our military needs. Congress has an up or down vote. You can't get in there and decide if you want to pull one out or add one onto the list, or horse trading. Your political influence as a member isn't going to influence those bases. It's either yes or no. You're either for budget reforms, saving money, fiscal responsibility, post-Cold War, hey, it's time to cut back. We have a deficit issue we want to address. If you frame the debate in that sense, you're much more incentivized as a member to vote for that, regardless of if something in your state's getting cut, because you have that traceable link that's been severed. Well, this was the list that was provided to us. I voted for it, but it closed bases all over the country, and it was for a better cause. It was not a list I would have developed. You can't blame me for that, right? Basically, it's the notion that members will use any means necessary to avoid accountability for their actions. They don't want to be held responsible And the final strategy is called modification. We see this occasionally. And so that's like, as you're building as a coalition leader is building a coalition of members of Congress to pass a policy, they may have to actually work with seemingly disparate groups, getting them to work together. And so, a great example of this, how it's used, I think, more nefariously than for the good of the legislation, is that there are times when very hot buttons issues like gun control, abortion, those are the type of high profile, very visceral issues that can get attached to legislation as a way of modifying it to really either incentivize or disincentivize a member from supporting it. And so a great example of that is the healthcare legislation. This was talked about by the speaker at the event on Friday. The healthcare person said, yeah, there was an abortion provision in there about federal funding for abortions. It's a very small part of the overarching legislation. But by modifying it, by inserting that, I'm thinking whoever's raising that issue, whoever's trying to put that in, probably is using it as an angle to pick off members who would otherwise support it. Sort of your conservative Democrats who, that's a hot button issue for cultural reasons in the districts they represent. It's almost a political strategy to tank something. We call this the poison pill. So everything looks good, but, and it doesn't even always have to be anything related to that particular modification. So tax bills could get riders that have to do with gun control or abortion or educational loans or things like that. Things that people are passionate about that will suddenly cause them to reassess whether or not they want to be on it. So that's a quick run through of the logic of congressional action. Again, the big takeaways is that congressmen are smart. They're incentivized to act in a way that will help them get reelected. And assuming that, they're looking at the public as groups. The attentive groups, whose beliefs and preferences are very apparent typically, but more importantly, that inattentive group. And I need to think about very carefully what I might do that could awaken them. That was rather quick, but hopefully gets the gist of what Arnold's contribution is to this literature.